A farmer's plow struck a hidden message that could shatter our history books. That message is carved into the Kensington Runestone, a slab of greywacke found in a Minnesota field. Its runic letters tell a staggering tale of Norse explorers, a journey from Vinland, and a bloody massacre here in the American heartland in the year 1362. This single stone claims to rewrite the narrative of an entire continent, placing European feet on Midwest soil over 130 years before Columbus even set sail. But is it genuine, or is it the most audacious and enduring historical forgery ever created in the United States? By the end of this, you will possess all the evidence to judge this century-old mystery for yourself. We will examine cryptic runes that linguists call impossible, and explore why a simple farmer became the prime suspect. So, what does it truly mean when we discover a story we desperately want to believe? The greywacke slab was unearthed on a cold November day in 1898. Swedish immigrant farmer Olof Ohman and his son Edward were laboring to clear a field on their property near the small settlement of Kensington, Minnesota. As they worked to uproot a stubborn cluster of aspen trees, their plow struck something solid and unyielding beneath the frost-hardened earth. It was not a boulder, but a large, flat stone intricately woven into the gnarled root system of one particular tree. They pried it loose. The object was substantial, weighing just over 200 pounds and measured about 31 inches long, 16 inches wide, and 6 inches thick. But its true shock was revealed only after they brushed away the dirt. The face of the stone was covered in strange, angular markings, deeply carved and utterly unfamiliar. This was no ordinary rock. It was a tablet, and it was covered in writing. Word spread through the close-knit Scandinavian community like wildfire. Here, in the middle of a Minnesota field, a farmer had found a carved stone. To these Swedish and Norwegian immigrants, the markings did not look random. They bore a haunting, thrilling resemblance to the ancient runic alphabets of their homelands. The very idea was electrifying. This was not merely a curious artifact, it was a potential message, a direct thread pulled from the tapestry of their proud Viking heritage and somehow woven into the roots of an American tree. The stone instantly became a local sensation, a physical piece of old-world legend suddenly present in their new world reality. The immediate question, burning in every mind, was simple yet profound. What did these mysterious runes actually say? The stone's runes were not indecipherable for long. A local schoolteacher, well-versed in Scandinavian languages, began the painstaking work of translation. What emerged from those weathered grooves was a story so specific, so dramatic, it seemed ripped from a saga. The inscription, carved in a mix of runic letters and coded numerals, told a harrowing tale. It reads as follows: 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland, very far west. We had camped by a lake with 2 skerries 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were out fishing one day. After we came home, we found 10 men red with blood and dead. Ave Maria, save us from evil. The message then gives a date, the year 1362. Let that sink in for a moment. This was not a simple marker or a name. It was a desperate record of catastrophe, a snapshot of terror frozen in stone over 6 centuries ago. Every detail was a seismic claim. The date, 1362, placed this event over 130 years after the last known Norse voyages from Greenland, in a period historians believed was a silence. The mention of Vinland directly connected these travelers to the legendary Norse settlements in Newfoundland, made famous by the sagas of Leif Erikson. But the location was the real shock. This stone was found over 1,400 miles inland from the Atlantic coast, and over 100 miles from the nearest navigable Great Lake. It described a camp by a lake with 2 skerries, or rocky islets, a day's journey north. If genuine, it meant a band of Norse explorers had penetrated deep into the heart of North America, further than any credible evidence had ever suggested. And their story ended in blood. 10 of their companions slaughtered. The stark image of men red with blood and dead is chilling in its simplicity. The final plea, a VM for Ave Maria, save us from evil, is a cry across the centuries. This single paragraph did not just suggest contact. It narrated a tragic expedition with names, a purpose, and a brutal end. It offered a complete, heartbreaking story where before there was only archaeological silence. The implications were world-changing, but a good story, especially one that rewrites history, demands the most rigorous scrutiny, and almost immediately the cracks began to show. The Stone's translation sent immediate shockwaves far beyond that Minnesota field. It reached the desks of university scholars, men who dedicated their lives to the study of ancient languages and Norse history. Their verdict was swift, unanimous, and devastating. Leading the charge was Olof J. Breda, a professor of Scandinavian languages at the University of Minnesota. After a careful examination, Breda delivered a crushing analysis. He declared the runes on the Kensington stone were not a coherent medieval script at all. Instead, he argued they were a clumsy patchwork, a jumble of runic forms borrowed from different time periods and regions, mixed with modern Swedish and Danish lettering. The grammar, he stated, was a mess. The numerals used to date the stone, 1362, were not how a 14th century Norseman would have written them. To the trained eye of a linguist, the inscription looked like someone had tried to write Old Norse using a modern Scandinavian dictionary and gotten it profoundly wrong. The academic world quickly closed ranks around this judgment. The stone was labeled a crude forgery, a fantasy carved by a modern hand, and it was dismissed from serious historical consideration. But in the communities of Swedish and Norwegian immigrants across Minnesota and the Midwest, this scholarly dismissal fell on deaf ears. For them, the Kensington Runestone was not a linguistic puzzle to be solved, it was a revelation to be celebrated. It represented something far deeper than academic credibility. It was a matter of identity and pride. These were people who had left their homelands, crossed an ocean, and were carving out a life in a new and often harsh land. The stone told them that their own legendary ancestors, the fierce Vikings of the sagas, had done the very same thing centuries before. It was proof that their bloodline had not just touched the distant shores of Vinland, but had ventured into the vast interior, into the very heart of the continent they now called home. The stone transformed from an artifact into a symbol. It validated their own journey, connecting their modern struggle to an ancient, heroic narrative. It said, "We belong here because our people were here first." This created the fundamental conflict that would define the stone's story for over a century. On one side stood the gatekeepers of established history, armed with textbooks and linguistic rules. On the other stood a populist wave of belief, fueled by cultural pride and a powerful desire for a different origin story. The battle lines were drawn not just over a rock, but over who gets to write history, and in this fight, the stone itself would soon point a finger directly at the man who found it. Into this simmering conflict stepped a man who would become the stone's single most influential voice, a historian and writer named H. Hjalmar R. Holland. He was a Norwegian-American with a deep passion for his heritage and an unshakable conviction that the Norse had explored deep into North America. When he learned of the Kensington Stone's dismissal by academics, he saw not a forgery, but a profound injustice. Holland approached the stone's finder, Olof Ohman, and in a pivotal moment purchased the heavy slab for a modest sum, taking personal possession of the artifact and, with it, the burden of its proof. This acquisition marked the beginning of a lifelong crusade that would consume decades of his life. H. Hjalmar Holland became the Kensington Runestone's champion, its defender, and its most brilliant promoter. He was a true believer, and he wielded a pen and a podium with missionary zeal. He wrote multiple books dedicated solely to the stone, gave countless lectures across the country, and penned endless articles for newspapers and magazines. He presented the stone at world's fairs, arguing its case directly to the public, often bypassing the skeptical academic institutions that had rejected it. Ohman was a master of narrative, framing the stone not as a dry linguistic specimen, but as a thrilling piece of a lost Viking saga playing out on the American prairie. His arguments were multifaceted and cleverly constructed to counter the critics. First, he tackled the stone itself. He pointed to its physical condition, arguing that the weathering on the carved inscriptions appeared ancient, not freshly cut. The Greywacke stone was hard, and the grooves, he claimed, showed the patina of centuries, not years. Second, he addressed the runes. Where linguists saw a jumbled mess, Ohman saw a sophisticated code. He argued that certain unusual runic forms were not mistakes, but deliberate clues, perhaps a secret cipher used by a 14th century party far from home. He presented them as evidence of authenticity, suggesting a forger would never be clever enough or knowledgeable enough to invent such complexities. But Ohman did not stop at the stone in his hand. He embarked on ambitious field research around the Kensington area, searching for any physical evidence that could corroborate the inscription's story. He documented peculiar, triangular holes carved into lakeshore boulders, which he identified as Norse mooring stones, used to tie up their ships. He collected reports of old iron axes found in the region that he believed were of Scandinavian design. For Ohman, each of these discoveries was another piece of a vast puzzle, all pointing to a Norse presence in Minnesota. He was building a case not just for a stone, but for an entire historical event. Yet herein lies the enduring controversy around H. Hjalmar Ohman. Was he an objective researcher uncovering a hidden truth, or was he a profoundly biased advocate, seeing exactly what he wanted to see in every rock and rusted tool? His tireless promotion undoubtedly saved the stone from obscurity, but it also colored every piece of evidence he presented. He was a lawyer for the defense, building the strongest possible case for his client, often dismissing alternative explanations for the mooring holes or the axes. His brilliant storytelling captured the public's imagination, but it also created a divide. For his supporters, he was a visionary. For his detractors, he was the architect of an elaborate hoax. And this brings us back to the beginning, to the quiet farmer on whose land the entire mystery was rooted. The most damning evidence against the Kensington Runestone comes not from the soil, but from the words themselves. To understand why, we must listen to the linguists, the codebreakers of ancient language, who have studied the inscription with a cold, analytical eye. Their conclusion is not a matter of opinion, but of grammatical and historical fact. They argue the stone's text is a tapestry woven with threads from the wrong centuries, creating a pattern that would have been impossible in the year 1362. Let's break down these fatal anachronisms, starting with the very first line. The inscription begins with the phrase, 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland. The critical word here is the one translated as exploration journey. In the runic text, this word is represented as OPD, a GELSE, FORD. This is a modern Swedish and Danish compound word, opdagelsephard. It is a word born of the age of discovery of Columbus and Magellan. In the 14th century, a Norse explorer would never have used such a term. Their vocabulary for travel and discovery came from the Viking Age, words like firth or late, meaning a trip or a search. Opdagelsephard is a glaring, modern fingerprint on a supposedly ancient artifact. Next, examine the date. The stone clearly states the year 1362. But look at how those numbers are written. They use a decimal system with place value, the numeral 1 followed by the numeral 3, then 6, then 2. This is an Arabic numeral system, the same one we use today. Medieval Norse carvers did not write dates this way. In the 14th century, they would have used Roman numerals or more commonly, spelled the entire year out in words. The inscription's use of modern Arabic numerals is like finding a digital watch buried in a Roman ruin. It is simply out of time and place. Finally, and most technically, we come to the runic alphabet itself. This is where the forgery theory becomes visually undeniable. The runes carved on the Kensington stone are not from a single, consistent medieval futhark, the runic alphabet. Instead, they are a peculiar mixture. Several of the runic letters match those from the Dalecarlian runes, a variant used in a specific region of Sweden, but critically, these Dalecarlian runes were in common use only in the 18th and 19th centuries, right up to the time of the stone's discovery. They were used by farmers and traders on calendars and in ledgers. Other runes on the stone are pulled from the medieval Scandinavian runic alphabet, but their forms are incorrect or anachronistic. Imagine taking a few letters from a medieval manuscript, mixing them with letters from a 19th century newspaper headline, and then adding a few symbols you invented yourself. To a runologist, that is exactly what the Kensington inscription looks like. The grammar compounds the problem. The word order and the use of certain prepositions reflect modern Swedish sentence structure, not the Old Norse of the sagas. The collective weight of this evidence leads linguists to one inescapable scenario. The forger was likely a Swedish immigrant living in Minnesota in the late 1800s. This person had a general folk knowledge of runes, perhaps from seeing them on old family belongings or in almanacs from home. They knew the romantic stories of Vikings and Vinland. They cobbled together this inscription using the runic shapes they were familiar with from their own time, the modern Scandinavian words they spoke every day, and the Arabic numerals they used in their account books. They created a compelling story, but they lacked the specialized academic knowledge of 14th century Norse language that would have been required to make it authentic. The stone, therefore, is not a window to the past, but a mirror reflecting the hopes, the pride, and the linguistic world of a 19th century Scandinavian American. This linguistic case seems airtight, a scholarly verdict delivered, but if the stone is such an obvious fake, why does the debate rage on more than a century later? The answer lies in a series of physical discoveries that seem to support the impossible story. Yet the stone itself seemed to whisper a different story, one written not in words, but in the very rock. To settle the debate, many looked past the runes and focused on the stone's physical body, its scars and its age. This was the realm of geology, a science that promised hard, measurable facts. Early examinations of the Greywacke slab appeared promising for believers. In the early 20th century, several geologists were asked to inspect the carving. They noted that the grooves of the inscription showed significant weathering, a softened, rounded appearance in the cross-section that they felt was inconsistent with a fresh, late 19th century cut. The weathering rind, the thin layer of oxidation on the stone's surface, appeared to extend into the carved letters themselves, suggesting the cuts were exposed to the elements for a very long time. This preliminary opinion became a cornerstone of the pro-authenticity argument. If the carving was centuries old, then the linguistic problems somehow had to be explained away, because the rock itself did not lie. But geology, like history, is subject to interpretation. Critics pointed to two powerful counter-observations. First, they asked people to look closely at the carving's grooves. While the edges might be rounded from weathering, the overall lines are remarkably even and deep, with a consistent V-shaped profile. This, some argued, is the classic signature of a metal chisel and hammer, tools readily available to a 19th century farmer, not the more irregular, shallower cuts typical of a medieval rune carver using a simpler tool. Second, and perhaps more damning, was the context of its discovery. Olof Ohman found the stone entangled in the roots of a large aspen tree. Tree roots are powerful forces of nature, capable of cracking foundations and swallowing rocks. If the stone had been lying on the surface for 500 years, roots would have grown over, around, and through it, likely fracturing the slab. The fact it was found intact within the root system suggested to skeptics a much shorter timeline. They proposed a simpler scenario: someone carved the stone, then buried it deliberately at the base of a young tree. As that tree grew over the next few decades, its roots naturally enveloped the stone, creating the illusion it had been there for centuries. This was a perfectly natural process that required no medieval Norsemen, only patience and a sapling. The debate might have remained in this stalemate of competing interpretations if not for a dramatic new claim at the dawn of the 21st century. In the year 2000, a forensic geologist named Scott Wolter entered the scene, applying modern analytical techniques to the ancient question. Using a high-powered microscope, Wolter examined the mineral grains within the carved grooves. His conclusion was explosive. He stated that the weathering within the runic letters, specifically the breakdown of certain mineral components called micas, was so advanced that it would have required a minimum of 200 years of exposure and likely much more. He argued this weathering was impossible to fake and was consistent with a medieval origin. Wolter's study, presented with scientific authority and modern instrumentation, reignited the controversy, giving believers their most powerful piece of physical evidence in decades. It was no longer just about old geologists' opinions. It was about data from an electron microscope. However, the scientific community is built on peer review, and Wolter's methods and conclusions faced immediate and severe criticism from mainstream geologists. Experts pointed out that the rate of weathering for Greywacke in Minnesota's specific climate, with its freeze-thaw cycles, acidic soil, and moisture, was not precisely known and could vary wildly. They argued that Wolter had made a critical error in assuming a constant, slow weathering rate without accounting for accelerated decay if the stone had been buried in wet, organic soil for long periods. A stone buried for 50 years in the root-rich, damp earth under that aspen tree could weather far more quickly than a stone sitting exposed on a hillside. Furthermore, critics stated that Wolter's selection of samples and his interpretation of the microscopic features were subjective, leaning toward a predetermined conclusion. The central critique was stark: his methodology was flawed, and his results could not be independently verified or replicated under controlled, scientific conditions. To the academic geological establishment, Wolter's work was not the final word, but another chapter in a long story of motivated reasoning. So if the stone and its carving could not provide definitive proof, where else could believers look? They turned their eyes to the wider landscape, searching for any other trace that could corroborate the runestone's lonely tale. All of this evidence circles back to one quiet, enigmatic figure at the very center of the mystery: Olof Ohman. He was the farmer who found the stone, who pulled it from the earth tangled in the roots of that aspen tree. To many skeptics, he is not just the discoverer, but the most likely creator. When we examine his background, the picture that emerges is not of a simple, uneducated laborer, but of a man who possessed, perhaps, just the right mix of skills, knowledge, and motive to pull off an incredible deception. Olof Ohman was a Swedish immigrant who arrived in Minnesota in 1879. He was literate, and records show he owned books, including a Swedish history text that contained information on runes. More importantly, he was not just a farmer, he had worked as a stonemason. This is a critical detail. A stonemason understands how to work stone, how to carve it cleanly with chisels, how to judge the hardness of Greywacke. The even deep grooves on the Kensington stone, which some argued were too perfect for an ancient carver, would have been well within the capabilities of a 19th century stonemason. He had the literal tools and the practical skill to create the physical object, but what about the knowledge to write the inscription? Here, the plot thickens within Ohman's own social circle. One of his closest friends was a man named Sven Fogelblad. Fogelblad was not a farmer. He was a well-educated schoolteacher and a lay minister. He had studied in Sweden and was deeply knowledgeable in history, theology, and languages. Crucially, he was known to have an interest in and specific books about runes. If Ohman needed a co-conspirator to help craft a linguistically clever, if flawed, runic message, Sven Fogelblad would have been the perfect accomplice. Together, a stonemason and a scholarly teacher could have combined their talents to produce the stone. So we have means and opportunity, but what about motive? Why would a hardworking immigrant farmer go to such elaborate lengths? The possibilities are as human as they are intriguing. Perhaps it began as a private prank or a local joke meant to baffle neighbors, a story that spun wildly out of control when the wider world took notice. Perhaps it was a bid for notoriety or even financial gain, though Ohman famously sold the heavy, cumbersome stone to H. Hjalmar Holland for very little money and never seemed to capitalize on the fame. The most compelling motive, however, is one of cultural pride. The late 1800s were a time of intense nativist sentiment in America. Scandinavian immigrants, while white, still faced prejudice and were often looked down upon as simple foreigners. The Kensington Runestone offered a powerful rebuttal. It screamed that their ancestors were not late-coming peasants, but brave, pioneering explorers who reached the heart of the continent centuries before the English, the Spanish, or the Pilgrims. It was a monument to their heritage, carved not just in stone, but into the very land. Creating such a monument could have been seen as an act of profound validation, a gift to their community. Ohman himself remained a puzzling figure throughout the controversy. He never wavered in his story of finding the stone, and he maintained a stoic, almost annoyed demeanor toward the endless questions and accusations. He never appeared to revel in the attention. When pressed by skeptics, his defense was famously simple and rustic. He would say, "Do I look like a man who would sit down and carve a stone for a joke?" He presented himself as exactly what he seemed, a humble farmer caught up in a storm he never intended. This plain-spoken demeanor has, for many, been his greatest defense. Could this simple man, with his calloused hands and weary eyes, really be the architect of a hoax that would fool scholars and captivate the world for over a century? Or was his very simplicity the perfect disguise for a brilliantly executed plan born from a deep, personal sense of pride? The stone offers no confession, only its cryptic message, leaving us to judge the man who brought it to light. But the story of the Kensington Runestone does not exist in a vacuum. It is, perhaps, the most famous character in a much wider and stranger drama of stones scattered across the North American landscape. If you start looking, you will find other mysterious, rune-carved rocks from Oklahoma to Maine, each with its own passionate defenders and skeptical detractors. This pattern forces a bigger question: was there a continent-wide Norse exploration, or is something else happening here? Let's look at a few key examples. In the wooded hills of eastern Oklahoma, you can find the Heavener Runestone. It's a large slab of sandstone with 8 runic characters carved vertically. Local legend claims it was discovered in the 19th century by Choctaw hunters, and it has been interpreted as a boundary marker or a navigational signpost left by Norse travelers. The proposed translations vary, often pointing to a date around the year 1000, but the runes themselves are problematic. They are from a medieval Scandinavian alphabet, but their specific forms and the message they spell are ambiguous. Critics argue the inscription could be a modern creation, perhaps by a Scandinavian immigrant miner or settler in the area during the late 1800s, a time when Oklahoma was being opened for settlement. Then, on the opposite side of the country, we have the Spirit Pond runestones. These were discovered in 1971 by a Walter Elliott near the coast of Maine. Not one, but 3 small stones were found, along with what appeared to be a crude map stone depicting the coastline. The inscriptions mix runes with what seemed to be Latin letters and Roman numerals, telling a confusing story of a journey and referencing the year 1401. Almost immediately, linguists identified glaring anachronisms. The runic forms were a jumble from different periods, and the language was a nonsensical mix of Old Norse and modern Scandinavian, much like the Kensington stone. The consensus quickly formed that these were clever 20th century fakes. possibly created as a hoax or even as an artistic experiment. Perhaps the most telling case is the Vinland runestone, because it is a story of a story. In the 1730s, French-Canadian explorer Pierre Gaultier de Varennes, Sieur de la Vérendrye, reported that Mandan Indians in the northern plains showed him a stone covered in strange markings, which he believed might be Tartaric writing. Later, in the 19th century, this account was reinterpreted by enthusiasts who claimed it must have been a Norse runestone. The stone itself was lost, leaving only a second-hand report. This is crucial. The physical evidence vanished, but the idea of the evidence persisted, shaped and molded by later desires to find Vikings in America. When you map these discoveries, a fascinating pattern emerges. The Heavener stone is in Oklahoma, an area settled by many Scandinavians in the late 19th century land runs. The Kensington stone is in Minnesota, the heart of Swedish and Norwegian immigration. The Spirit Pond stones are in Maine, which also had significant Scandinavian settlement. This is not necessarily proof of a hoax, but it strongly suggests a cultural phenomenon. In an era when proving a deep, noble heritage for your new homeland was a source of immense pride, the act of runestone planting may have become an almost subconscious tradition. It was a way for immigrant communities to literally carve their ancestry into the bedrock of America, to claim a pioneering role that predated Columbus and the English. Each stone, whether an intentional forgery, a well-meaning creation, or a genuinely misidentified artifact, served as a monument to a community's identity. So we are left with two competing narratives, each explaining the same set of stones. One is a history book narrative of intrepid Norse explorers venturing thousands of miles inland, leaving cryptic messages that were forgotten for centuries. The other is a social narrative of 19th and 20th century immigrants, using the symbols of their old world to write themselves into the foundational myths of their new world. One is a story of exploration, the other is a story of belonging, and in the quiet presence of these carved rocks, both stories are powerfully, compellingly human. The stone's journey did not end in a museum basement or a scholar's footnote. It broke free from academic journals and exploded into the heart of American popular culture, transforming from a disputed artifact into a powerful modern myth. This shift was cemented by a single, monumental event. In 1948, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., agreed to display the Kensington Runestone. For over a year, the gray slab sat under the bright lights of the nation's most prestigious museum. To the average visitor, this was not a conditional exhibit labeled a probable forgery. This was the Smithsonian saying, "This is important enough to show you." That implicit endorsement was a seismic victory for believers. It granted the stone a veneer of official legitimacy it had never possessed before, pulling it from the fringe and placing it squarely in the mainstream American consciousness. The public saw not a controversy, but a confirmed piece of a thrilling, hidden history. From there, the stone's fame multiplied. Major magazines like National Geographic featured it in articles, presenting the mystery to millions of living room coffee tables. These were not dry, academic treatises. They were lavishly illustrated adventures, inviting readers to ponder the incredible possibility of Vikings in Minnesota. Each article, each photograph, chipped away at skepticism and fed the public's appetite for a more romantic, more complex origin story than the one found in standard textbooks. This fertile ground gave rise to a whole genre of popular pseudo-history books. Authors, often inspired by H. Jalmar Holland's arguments, wove elaborate narratives connecting the Kensington stone to lost Norse colonies, Templar knights, and even pre-Columbian transatlantic voyages. These books sold not on peer-reviewed evidence, but on the irresistible power of a what-if story. They presented a secret history, one that felt more exciting and more inclusive for many Americans of European descent, offering an ancestral claim to the continent that predated the Mayflower by centuries. In Minnesota, this process went even further. The Kensington Runestone ceased to be merely an artifact and became an icon. It is a point of immense state pride, a unique piece of local lore that sets Minnesota apart. You can visit a dedicated runestone museum in the town of Alexandria. You can drive down a state highway and see an official Minnesota historical marker proudly detailing the stone's discovery and its contested story. It is celebrated in local festivals, featured on tourism websites, and immortalized in community murals. Its authenticity, in this context, becomes almost secondary. The stone is a beloved character in Minnesota's own story, a symbol of the state's rugged, pioneering spirit and its rich Scandinavian heritage. It belongs to the people, not the professors. Finally, the stone found its perfect modern home on television. It became a staple of alternative history documentary programs, the kind with dramatic music, cryptic visuals, and phrases like Ancient Secrets in History channeled. These shows thrive on mystery, not resolution. The Kensington Runestone is the ideal subject, a puzzle with no definitive answer. Each episode can present the linguistic case, then the geological counter case, then the cultural motivations, leaving the viewer tantalized and unsure. In this format, the stone's truth is less important than its enduring power to fascinate. It has transcended the binary of real versus fake to become something else entirely, a permanent fixture in our cultural imagination, a story we keep telling because it speaks to our deepest desires to discover, to belong, and to rewrite the map of the past. Yet even with its place in popular culture secured, the core mystery of the stone remains scientifically unresolved. The dawn of the 21st century promised new answers, bringing powerful laboratory tools to bear on this old fieldstone controversy. Leading this charge was geologist Scott Wolter, who employed a scanning electron microscope to examine the Kensington Runestone at a level of detail never before possible. This instrument allowed him to peer into the very crystal structure of the Greywacke within the carved grooves. His analysis focused on the breakdown of specific mineral grains, particularly micas, which weather and flake away over time when exposed to the elements. Wolter's conclusion, published in the year 2005, was definitive and dramatic. He stated the degree of mineral disintegration he observed within the runic letters was so extensive, it would have required a minimum of 200 years of exposure to occur, and likely much longer. In his professional judgment, this weathering was impossible to replicate artificially and was consistent with a medieval origin. For believers, this was the smoking gun, the hard physical data that finally overruled a century of linguistic skepticism. Science, it seemed, had vindicated the stone. However, the academic community's response to Wolter's findings was not acceptance, but a chorus of rigorous and pointed rebuttals. Linguists and runologists remained unmoved. They argued that even the most compelling geological data about the stone's physical age could not erase the anachronisms carved into its surface. The modern Swedish word for exploration, the Arabic numeral date, the mixed runic alphabet, these were not features that could be explained away by weathering rates. They were categorical errors, like finding a perfectly preserved parchment written in modern English that claimed to be from the court of King Arthur. The linguistic evidence, they maintained, was not merely suggestive, it was dispositive. It pointed directly to a 19th century creator, and no amount of mineral analysis could change the words that were actually written. Archaeologists joined the critique, pointing out the complete absence of any corroborating physical evidence from the medieval period at the site. No Norse artifacts, no campfire remains, no tools, no bodies, nothing but the solitary stone. In archaeology, context is everything, and the Kensington Runestone stood in a contextual vacuum. The criticism extended to Wolter's geological methods themselves. Peer-reviewed journals published articles challenging his assumptions. Experts noted that the rate of weathering for Greywacke in Minnesota's specific environment, with its intense freeze-thaw cycles, acidic soil chemistry, and constant moisture when buried, was poorly understood and could be highly variable. A key counter-argument emerged. If Olof Ohman had carved the stone and then buried it at the base of that young aspen tree, the stone would have spent decades encased in a damp, biologically active environment. Tree roots exude acids, soil microbes are at work, and moisture is trapped. This microenvironment could dramatically accelerate the weathering process, creating significant mineral decay in just 50 years, not 500. Walter's 200-year minimum, critics argued, was based on an assumed rate of slow, surface weathering, not the accelerated decay of a buried object. Furthermore, they questioned the subjectivity of interpreting the scanning electron microscope images, suggesting Walter may have seen what he wanted to see in the crystalline patterns. The scientific establishment's verdict was clear. One man's geological analysis, however confidently presented, could not overturn the collective weight of linguistic, historical, and archaeological evidence. So here we stand today, in an age of carbon dating and DNA analysis, and the Kensington Runestone remains stubbornly enigmatic. Modern science, for all its power, has failed to deliver a definitive, universally accepted answer. Instead, it has deepened the mystery, adding another layer of conflicting interpretation. We now have two parallel lines of evidence, each seemingly robust within its own discipline, yet pointing in opposite directions. The geology, as interpreted by one camp, whispers of centuries. The linguistics, as interpreted by the other, shouts of the 1890s. This impasse is the stone's ultimate legacy. It has become a perfect Rorschach test, revealing not objective truth, but what the observer wishes to find. For those who want to believe in a hidden Viking saga, the weathered grooves are proof. For those who trust in the rules of language and historical context, the anachronistic words are the final word. The stone refuses to be solved, and in that refusal, it holds our attention captive. It forces us to ask a more profound question about history itself. What matters more, the physical object or the story it tells? And when the two contradict, which one do we choose to believe? This silence from the earth is perhaps the most powerful argument against the stone. An inscription is one thing, but archaeology demands proof you can hold in your hand. The message carved into that Greywacke slab is incredibly specific. It tells us exactly what to look for. 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians, a party of 30 men, had a camp by a lake with 2 skerries, 1 day's journey north from this stone. This is not a vague, poetic line. It is a practical, geographical description. 30 men are not ghosts. They need to eat, to build shelter, to make fires, to repair tools and weapons. They would leave a footprint on the land, a scatter of evidence that should, in theory, still be there centuries later. Hjalmar Holland, the stone's great champion, understood this. He spent years searching the lakes region north of Kensington, trying to match the description to a real location. He believed he found the spot, pointing to a lake with the appropriate rocky islands. But finding a lake that fits the description is the easy part. Minnesota has over 10,000 lakes, many with islands. The real challenge was finding anything at all, that those 30 men left behind. And here, the search failed completely. No one, not Holland nor any subsequent investigator, has ever uncovered a single, verified Norse artifact from the 14th century in that area. No rusted iron nails, no fragments of a Norse cloak pin, no charcoal from a campfire that dates to the 1300s, no burial mound for those 10 men red with blood and dead. The ground is silent. Now contrast this with what real, undisputed Norse archaeology looks like. Far to the north and east, on the wind-swept coast of Newfoundland, Canada, lies the site of Elance Ox Meadows. Discovered in the 1960s, this is the only confirmed Norse settlement in North America outside of Greenland. Archaeologists there didn't find a single, lonely stone. They uncovered the foundations of 8 distinct buildings, clear outlines of Norse-style longhouses and workshops. They excavated a smithy with a stone anvil and slag from iron working. They found a bronze cloak pin, a stone oil lamp, a whetstone for sharpening tools, and even a simple wooden spindle whorl for spinning yarn. This is the debris of daily life, the physical echo of people who lived, worked, and died in that place. Olof Meadows gives us a complete picture because it was a base, a settlement meant to last. The Kensington story describes a temporary camp, a group on the move, so we wouldn't expect grand longhouses. But we would expect something. 30 men staying in one place, even for a short time, would lose or break things. A fire steel could drop into the mud. An arrowhead could snap and be discarded. A man might bury a personal item. In archaeology, these lost objects are our primary clues. Their total absence around Kensington is deafening. Proponents of the stone offer explanations. Perhaps the group was attacked and slaughtered, their camp looted and destroyed, leaving no trace. Perhaps they were so careful, so transient, that they carried every single item away with them. Perhaps the real campsite hasn't been found yet, but these arguments strain credibility. A massacre site would still leave forensic evidence, disturbed earth, broken weapon fragments, perhaps bones. And the idea that 30 men in the 14th century, traveling in a wilderness, would leave not one scrap of metal, not one piece of culturally distinct trash, defies everything we know about how humans interact with their environment. We are, by nature, messy creatures. We leave marks. The archaeological void surrounding the Kensington Runestone is a hole in the narrative you can drive a truck through. It forces a simple, logical question. If the story on the stone is true, where is everything else? How could 30 men vanish from history so completely, leaving behind only a beautifully composed epitaph carved in a language they arguably wouldn't have used, and nothing else? The stone stands alone, not as a piece of a puzzle, but as a solitary monument in an empty field. The stone's inscription makes a direct and deliberate link to the most famous chapter of Norse exploration in the Americas, Vinland. This was a masterstroke by its creator, for it tethers this Minnesota mystery to a real, verified piece of history. The Vinland sagas, written down centuries ago in Iceland, tell the epic stories of Leif Erikson and others who sailed west from Greenland around the year 1000. They describe discovering a land rich with wild grapes and timber, which they called Vinland. For a long time, these sagas were considered just that, legendary stories. That changed dramatically in the 1960s with the discovery of Olof Meadows in Newfoundland. Archaeologists uncovered the unmistakable remains of Norse buildings, proving that the Vikings did indeed establish a foothold on the North American continent, exactly as the sagas described. This site is our one concrete anchor, a confirmed point on the map of Norse exploration, so when the Kensington Runestone mentions a journey from Vinland, it is invoking this powerful, proven history. It is saying we are part of that story, but this is where the connection strains and then snaps under the weight of time and distance. Olof Meadows was a settlement from around the year 1000. The Kensington stone is dated to 1362. That is a gap of over 3.5 centuries. What happened in those intervening years, the Greenland colonies, the launching point for those early Vinland voyages, were in a state of catastrophic collapse by the 1300s. Climate change, known as the Little Ice Age, was making farming impossible. Trade with Europe had dwindled to nothing. The settlements were shrinking, starving, and fading into isolation. The idea that a robust, well-equipped expedition of 30 men could be organized and launched from a dying colony in 1362 is, historically, almost unthinkable. Their survival would have been a daily struggle, not exploration, but let's entertain the possibility. Imagine a group did set out from a remnant Greenland settlement or even a mythical, surviving Vinland outpost. Their journey, as described, becomes a logistical nightmare of epic proportions. To reach the Kensington area, they would have had to sail down the coast, then navigate inland. The most plausible route, often suggested, is to sail into Hudson Bay and then travel south via river systems. Look at a map. The distance from the Atlantic coast to central Minnesota is over 2,500 miles of utterly unknown, unforgiving wilderness. They would have had to portage their boats across countless miles of forest and prairie, carrying all their supplies. They would have had to hunt and forage in an ecosystem completely foreign to them, avoiding conflict with the numerous Native American nations who inhabited these lands. And for what? What was their motive? The sagas tell us the Norse went to Vinland for timber, for grapes, for new land to settle. The American interior in the 1300s offered no known precious metals, no trade routes, no clear agricultural advantage. It was a vast, empty expanse compared to the coastal resources they knew. A journey of that length and danger, with no clear economic or survival incentive, makes little sense. It would be like a group of struggling pilgrims from Jamestown suddenly deciding to walk to the Rocky Mountains for no apparent reason. Furthermore, if such an incredible journey had taken place, wouldn't there be some trace, some hint, along the way? Not a single Norse artifact has ever been found along the proposed routes from Hudson Bay to Minnesota. No campsites, no broken tools, no evidence of their passage. The Kensington stone appears not as a milestone on a trail, but as a single, miraculous blip in the middle of a blank map. The Vinland connection, then, is a double-edged sword. It lends the stone an air of authenticity by borrowing from a real historical tradition, but when you examine the timeline and the terrain, that connection unravels. It asks us to believe in a journey that defies the historical context of a dying Greenland, ignores the brutal logistics of medieval travel, and leaves no physical evidence across a continent. The stone points to Vinland, but the map of reality shows no path back. That final, desperate plea Ave Maria, save us from evil, leads us directly to the stone's most unforgettable image, the 10 men found red with blood and dead. This is not a dry record. It is a scene of visceral horror, a moment of pure human terror frozen in stone. It is the narrative heart of the entire inscription, and its power is undeniable. When you read those words, you don't just see runes. You see a camp returning from a quiet day of fishing to a nightmare. You smell the iron scent in the air. You feel the shock and the dread. This vivid, emotional detail is a masterstroke of storytelling. It transforms the artifact from a potential boundary marker or a simple land claim into a tragic human document. It makes the stone feel authentic because it speaks to something universal: fear, loss, and the desperate need to be remembered. Consider this from the perspective of a potential 19th century creator. If your goal was to craft a forgery that would capture hearts and defy easy dismissal, what would you include? A bland statement of arrival or possession could be seen as a practical fake, a crude attempt to claim land. But a tale of sudden, bloody tragedy that evokes immediate sympathy, it bypasses the analytical part of the brain and goes straight for the gut. A story of massacre makes the carvers seem like real people, victims of a cruel fate, not just anonymous explorers. It begs the question, who would invent such a grim detail for a mere hoax? The emotional weight of the story becomes its own shield against accusations of fraud. A forger with a keen understanding of human psychology would know that a tragic hero is far more believable than a triumphant one. This narrative choice also echoes the very traditions it claims to come from. The Norse sagas are filled with sudden violence, betrayal, and heroic last stands. They are stories of conflict and fate. A 19th century Scandinavian immigrant raised on these tales would have been steeped in this dramatic tradition. Including a bloody ambush aligns the Kensington stone perfectly with the saga aesthetic. It feels Norse because it tells a Norse kind of story. The phrase "red with blood" is stark and simple, much like the prose in the Icelandic sagas. A modern storyteller, aiming to create something that felt authentically ancient, might instinctively reach for this kind of dramatic, fatalistic element. It adds a layer of epic gravity, suggesting the carvers were not just lost, but doomed. Yet, for all its narrative power, the massacre detail also raises practical questions that a genuine survivor might have answered differently. The inscription is eerily devoid of crucial context. Who killed the 10 men? Was it a rival Norse faction or an attack by native people? The stone does not say. In a genuine record of terror, meant perhaps as a warning to others or a message to God, wouldn't you identify the threat? Furthermore, the logistics are puzzling. The group finds 10 of their comrades dead. They take the time to carve a lengthy, intricate message into incredibly hard stone, a process that would have taken many hours, if not days, while presumably still in danger from whatever force just slaughtered their friends. Would their first instinct be to undertake such a slow, laborious task, or would they flee or bury their dead or prepare for another attack? The dramatic story, while compelling, introduces a note of theatricality that feels slightly staged, as if the need for a poignant ending outweighed the frantic reality of survival. So we are left with two interpretations of that chilling line. In one, it is the raw, unvarnished cry of a terrified survivor, a genuine artifact of a real catastrophe. In the other, it is the brilliant, calculated flourish of a storyteller who knew that to make a lie stick, you must wrap it in a truth that everyone can feel, the truth of human suffering. The stone's greatest strength, its heartbreaking story, is also the source of its deepest suspicion. It reminds us that the most believable fictions are often the ones that move us. The blood on the stone opens a door to even wilder possibilities. If we step away from Olof Ohman as the sole suspect, the landscape of potential creators expands into realms of secret societies and lost civilizations. Some of the most ardent defenders of the stone's authenticity argue that it is simply too strange, too specific, to be a simple farmer's prank. They propose that its true origins lie not in the 19th century, but in a shadowy chapter of pre-Columbian history involving groups far more exotic than Norse explorers. The most popular of these fringe theories points to the Knights Templar. According to this narrative, after the Templar Order was suppressed in the early 1300s, a fleet of fleeing knights sailed across the Atlantic with legendary treasures, perhaps even the Holy Grail. They supposedly traveled inland, using knowledge passed down from earlier Norse contacts, and carved the Kensington stone as a record of their journey or a marker for their hidden refuge. Proponents of this idea point to the Ave Maria inscription as a distinctly Catholic plea, more fitting for a medieval knight than a pagan-descended Norseman. Another theory suggests the carvers were Welsh explorers, followers of the legendary Prince Madoc, who is said to have discovered America in the 12th century. These theories are captivating, weaving together threads of conspiracy, lost treasure, and forbidden history. They are also almost universally dismissed by mainstream scholars. There is not a single shred of credible historical or archaeological evidence linking the Knights Templar or a Welsh prince to 14th century North America, let alone to a Minnesota field. The linguistic problems with the stone remain fatal. The inscription's modern Scandinavian elements cannot be explained by a band of lost Templars who would have spoken Old French or Latin. These narratives, while entertaining, function more as modern myth-making, grafting the stone onto other popular mysteries to create an even grander secret history. A more grounded and historically plausible alternative theory stays within the 19th century, but shifts the motive from personal fraud to communal symbolism. Could the Kensington Runestone have been a creation not of one man, but of a group? Consider the context. Scandinavian immigrants in Minnesota were building tight-knit communities, establishing churches, schools, and fraternal organizations. Among these were various cultural clubs and secret societies, like the Scandinavian-founded Order of the Sons of Norway or local literary groups. These organizations were dedicated to preserving heritage, fostering pride, and creating a sense of shared identity in a new land. What if a few influential members of such a group conceived of the stone as a symbolic foundation myth? Their goal may not have been to deceive historians for fame or money, but to gift their community with a tangible, powerful link to a heroic past. They could have seen it as an elaborate, meaningful piece of folk art, a monument to their belief that their people's spirit of exploration was ancient and noble. A stonemason like Ohman and a learned teacher like his friend Sven Fogelblad would be perfect members for such a project. The stone, in this light, was never meant to be subjected to the microscope of university linguists. It was meant to be discovered by neighbors, to be marveled at locally, to become a cherished piece of local lore that reinforced a proud identity. It was a story carved in stone for the people who lived there, a story that said, "Our roots here are deeper than you know." This theory explains several puzzling aspects. It accounts for the mixture of runic knowledge drawn from the books and folk traditions within the immigrant community, and the glaring anachronisms which a dedicated scholarly conspirator might have avoided. It explains why Olof Ohman seemed so ambivalent about the fame and never sought profit. He may have been guarding a communal secret, not a personal hoax. Most importantly, it explains the stone's profound and immediate resonance. It was embraced not because it was scientifically credible, but because it felt true on a cultural level. It gave a scattered community of farmers and laborers a collective epic. The problem, of course, is that stories have a way of escaping their creators. Once the stone was pulled from the earth, the story took on a life of its own. Local newspapers picked it up, then regional papers, then scholars became involved, and the debate exploded onto a national stage. What began as a potent local symbol was suddenly thrust into the harsh light of academic scrutiny, a context its creators never anticipated or intended. The community's cherished myth became the world's controversial artifact, and the creators, bound by silence, could never step forward to explain their true purpose without destroying the very legend they had built. This leaves us with a poignant question: is a story any less powerful, any less meaningful to the people who hold it dear, if it was born from an act of collective creation rather than a medieval tragedy? The stone's true power may always lie in that space between history and belief, between a fact and a story that feels like it needs to be true. This yearning for a heroic past was not born in a Minnesota field. It was part of a much larger wave, a cultural tide sweeping across both the Atlantic Ocean and the 19th century. To truly understand why the Kensington Runestone was embraced so passionately, we must step back and see the world its discoverers lived in. The late 1800s were an era of intense nationalism across Europe, and Scandinavia was no exception. In Sweden and Norway, artists, writers, and scholars were actively reviving interest in the Viking Age. They were digging up burial mounds, publishing new editions of the sagas, and celebrating the Norse explorers as bold, adventurous ancestors. This wasn't just academic curiosity, it was nation-building. It was about crafting a proud, distinct identity rooted in a glorious past, especially as these countries navigated their place in a modernizing world. This romantic nationalism didn't stay in Europe. It crossed the ocean with the immigrants. Picture a Swedish farmer arriving in Minnesota. He faces a challenging new life, but he also encounters an American society that often viewed newcomers with suspicion. The dominant cultural narrative celebrated the Pilgrims and the Founding Fathers, stories that left no room for his own heritage. Where did he and his community fit into this grand American tale? The burgeoning Scandinavian nationalist movement provided the answer. It gave them a heritage to be proud of, a lineage of explorers and shipbuilders, of saga heroes and independent spirits. They began forming cultural societies, singing folk songs and telling the old stories, not just as nostalgia, but as a declaration. We are not just immigrants, they were saying. We are the descendants of the greatest explorers the world has ever known. And then, as if by magic, the earth itself seemed to agree. In 1898, Olof Ohman's plow struck the Kensington Runestone. Think about the timing. This wasn't a random find in 1750 or 1850. It appeared at the precise moment when the Scandinavian immigrant community was most actively searching for a symbol, for proof of their place in the New World's history. The stone was that perfect symbol. It wasn't a broken piece of pottery or a rusty nail. It was a full narrative, a saga carved in stone. It told a story of their Viking ancestors not just reaching the shore, but penetrating the very heart of the continent, facing tragedy with a prayer on their lips. It provided dramatic, tangible proof of Norse superiority and an ancient claim to the land. For a community asserting its identity against other groups, this was powerful stuff. It meant their ancestors had reached the Midwest long before the English, the Spanish, or even the French fur traders. It was the ultimate validation. The stone fulfilled a deep psychological need. It transformed their immigrant journey from a simple search for farmland into a return, a reclaiming of a destiny their forebears had mapped out centuries before. This context doesn't prove the stone is a fake, but it explains its electric reception and its fierce defense. The academic linguist saw a poorly constructed inscription. The immigrant community saw a flag planted for their people. They saw a reflection of their own struggle and perseverance in that tale of explorers far from home. The stone became a cultural relic, and questioning its authenticity felt to many like an attack on their pride, their identity, and their rightful place in the American story. The debate was never just about runes and weathering, it was about belonging, and when something answers that profound a need, the facts often get tangled in the roots of what we desperately want to believe. Ownership of the stone proved as contentious as its inscription. From the moment Olof Ohman pried it from the roots, the slab was more than a rock. It was a piece of property with shifting value and disputed meaning. Ohman himself seemed eager to be rid of the controversy it sparked, selling the heavy stone to the passionate believer H. Hjalmar Holland for the modest sum of $10 in 1907. This transaction placed the artifact into the hands of its most tireless advocate, but it did not settle its fate. Holland, for all his crusading, did not keep the stone forever. He eventually sold it, and it began a decades-long odyssey through a series of private owners and institutions, each transaction reflecting the stone's ambiguous status. Was it a priceless historical treasure or merely a fascinating conversation piece? Its price tag fluctuated with the tides of public opinion. At one point, it was even used as a stepping stone in a chicken coop, a humbling fate for an object that claimed to rewrite history. The stone's very mobility, its passage from hand to hand, underscored that it lacked the settled, curated home of a universally accepted relic. It was an orphan in the world of artifacts, too controversial for major museums to embrace unconditionally, yet too beloved to be discarded. This ambiguity inevitably led to legal conflict. In the mid-20th century, a complex dispute erupted over the stone's true ownership. A man named John J. Screen claimed he had purchased the stone from Holland years earlier, while Holland maintained he had only given Screen permission to display it. The case wound its way to the Minnesota Supreme Court. Think about that for a moment. The highest court in the state was asked to rule not on a contract or a crime, but on the rightful owner of a disputed runestone. The justices were tasked with untangling a web of verbal agreements and old receipts, a task far removed from interpreting runes but central to the stone's modern story. The court ultimately ruled in favor of H. Hjalmar Holland, reaffirming his ownership. This legal battle was more than a property dispute, it was a proxy war over the stone's narrative. Controlling the physical object meant having the authority to present its story to the world, to champion it as history, or to relegate it to folklore. The stone's journey finally found a permanent resting place, though not in the hallowed halls of the Smithsonian or a university archive. In the 1980s, after passing through several more hands, it was donated to the city of Alexandria, Minnesota, and placed in the care of the specially built Runestone Museum. This was a profoundly symbolic homecoming. The stone was not being enshrined by the academic establishment, but by the community that had always been its most fervent believers. The museum itself is a testament to this local faith, a place where the stone is presented not as a solved mystery, but as the centerpiece of a compelling local legend. Its value here is not strictly archaeological, it is cultural and economic. The Kensington Runestone draws thousands of visitors each year. It is featured on local signage and souvenirs, and it forms the bedrock of the region's unique historical identity. Its contested nature is its greatest asset, a talking point that transforms it from a silent rock into an experience. This entire ownership saga, from a $10 sale to a Supreme Court case to a museum donation, mirrors the central battle over the stone's soul. The legal fights were about more than money. They were struggles over who had the right to define the artifact. Was it a valuable historical object, demanding preservation and scholarly respect? Or was it a curious and valuable piece of folk art, a cultural symbol whose worth was measured in community pride and tourism dollars? The stone, by being neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, occupies a rare and powerful space. It is a cultural commodity, its worth constantly negotiated. Its physical journey through courts and collections proves that its meaning was never carved solely in its grey-wacky surface, but is continually written and rewritten by every person who fights to own it, display it, or simply believe in it. The stone's journey from a chicken coop to a museum was just the prelude. Today, the real battle over the Kensington Runestone is not fought in lecture halls or courtrooms, but across the glowing screens of the digital world. The internet has transformed this century-old mystery into a living, breathing, and endlessly debated phenomenon. Online forums dedicated to alternative history buzz with thousands of posts dissecting every groove on the stone. Enthusiasts upload high-resolution scans, allowing anyone with a web connection to zoom in on the weathering patterns and runic shapes from their living room, conducting forensic analysis that was once the exclusive domain of a handful of scholars. YouTube channels with millions of subscribers present elaborate documentaries, often with cinematic reenactments and ominous soundtracks, framing the stone as definitive proof of a suppressed Viking history. In these digital spaces, the traditional gatekeepers of academia hold little sway. A passionate amateur with a compelling video can reach more people in a week than a peer-reviewed journal article does in a decade. This has created parallel universes of understanding. In one, linguists have settled the matter. In the other, a vibrant global community of believers is just getting started, sharing theories, connecting dots, and building a consensus entirely their own. Social media platforms like Facebook and Reddit host dedicated groups where proponents and skeptics clash daily. A skeptic might post a detailed breakdown of the anachronistic runes, only to be met with a flood of counter-arguments citing Scott Wolter's geological analysis or pointing to obscure medieval maps. The debate is no longer polite or periodic, it is constant, immediate, and often intensely personal. Digital communities provide something traditional scholarship rarely does, a sense of belonging and shared mission. For someone who believes in the stone, finding an online group of thousands who agree is powerfully validating. It turns a lone belief into a collective identity, fortified against mainstream dismissal. This environment allows alternative theories to not just survive, but to flourish and evolve. Ideas that would be non-starters in a university department, like Templar connections or transatlantic voyages from a lost civilization, are discussed with serious fervor. The internet's algorithm-driven nature amplifies this, as platforms feed users more of what they engage with, creating echo chambers where the stone's authenticity becomes an unquestioned truth. Furthermore, the digital age has democratized the tools of investigation. Online databases catalog thousands of authentic runic inscriptions from Scandinavia. Amateur sleuths can now compare the Kensington runes side by side with verified examples from the 14th century, drawing their own conclusions. Some, after careful study, become convinced of the forgery. Others, looking at the same data, become even more convinced of a hidden cipher or a unique colonial dialect. The ability to conduct this research from a home computer has spawned a new generation of self-styled experts, each armed with digital evidence and a platform to share it. This has led to a fascinating, if sometimes chaotic, expansion of the mystery. Wildly different conclusions coexist online, from the stone being a Norse land claim to a coded message from a secret society to a modern art project. The definitive answer seems to recede further with every new forum thread and video essay. In essence, the Kensington Runestone has escaped its physical confines. It is no longer just a 200-pound slab in a Minnesota museum. It is a digital ghost, a meme, a symbol in a vast online war over history itself. The mystery is no longer curated by experts. It is owned, shaped, and endlessly debated by the global public, ensuring that this story carved in stone will never, ever be allowed to rest. The digital debate fuels a very real and bustling economy back in Alexandria, Minnesota. While theorists argue online, visitors flock to the heart of the mystery, drawn by the stone's powerful story. It has transformed from a disputed artifact into the cornerstone of an entire regional identity, one celebrated with genuine enthusiasm and entrepreneurial spirit. The town of Alexandria and the wider area around Kensington have fully embraced their Viking heritage, whether it is historically verified or not. At the center of it all stands the Runestone Museum, a modern building specifically constructed to house the 200-pound slab. Inside, you will not find a dry, academic presentation labeling it a forgery. Instead, you encounter a compelling narrative of discovery, mystery, and local pride. The stone is displayed as a hero, the centerpiece of exhibits that explore the possibility of Norse exploration, the lives of Scandinavian immigrants, and the enduring puzzle itself. The museum is not a shrine to a settled fact, but a temple to a wonderful question, and that question is a powerful tourist attraction. This appeal extends far beyond the museum walls. Drive through Alexandria and you will see the influence everywhere. You can stay at the Viking Motor Inn, its sign featuring a helmeted warrior. You can eat at a restaurant called the Viking Cafe. The local high school sports teams are called the Alexandria Cardinals, but the community proudly displays Viking ships and runic symbols on welcome signs and local logos. Every summer, the town hosts a popular festival called Runestone Days, a weekend celebration complete with parades, craft fairs, and historical reenactors. Vendors sell Scandinavian crafts and food, and the story of the stone is retold with gusto. The local Chamber of Commerce understands the value perfectly. The Kensington Runestone is their unique hook, a story that no other town in America can claim in quite the same way. It provides a distinct character in a crowded tourism landscape, giving people a reason to visit, to spend money on hotels, meals, and souvenirs. The economic impact is tangible and measurable, supporting jobs and businesses in a very real way. This raises a profound and almost philosophical question. At this point, after more than a century of controversy, does the actual historical truth of the Kensington Runestone even matter to the community that cherishes it? The stone's value has transcended archaeology. Its worth is no longer judged by the weathering of its grooves or the grammar of its runes, but by its power to bring people together, to define a place, and to fuel a local economy. It has become a foundational myth, and myths do not require verification to be powerful. They require belief, and belief here is abundant. For the residents, the stone symbolizes their ancestors' courage, their own immigrant perseverance, and the unique character of their home. It is a story they tell about themselves, and that story has built museums, filled hotel rooms, and created a shared sense of identity. The stone, in a very real sense, has done exactly what its inscription hoped. It has ensured that these explorers, whether real or imagined, are remembered. It has carved a place for them, and for the community that celebrates them, firmly on the map. The artifact may be locked in a display case, but the legend it spawned is alive, thriving, and walking the streets of Alexandria every single day. But the human desire to reshape history is not unique to a Minnesota field. The Kensington Runestone finds its place in a long and colorful tradition of great historical hoaxes, each one a mirror reflecting the hopes and blind spots of its time. Consider the infamous Piltdown Man, unearthed in England in the early 1900s. For decades, it was hailed as the missing link between apes and humans, a skull with a curiously human-like braincase and an ape-like jaw. It perfectly fit the prevailing and biased theory that human intelligence evolved in Europe first. The fossil was championed by powerful figures in the British scientific establishment, and it took over 40 years for modern testing to reveal the truth. The skull was a medieval human, the jaw was from an orangutan, and both had been chemically stained to look ancient. Piltdown succeeded because it told a story the world wanted to believe, one that placed Europe at the center of human origins, and because its proponents were too invested in the narrative to see the glaring anatomical contradictions. Then there was the Cardiff Giant, a sensation in 1869 New York. This was a 10-foot-tall stone figure of a man, supposedly a petrified giant from biblical times, discovered by well diggers. It captivated a public enthralled by stories of ancient races mentioned in scripture. The giant was a massive tourist attraction, drawing crowds willing to pay to see a wonder. It was, of course, a complete fraud, carved from gypsum and aged with acid. Its creator, a tobacconist named George Hull, had crafted it precisely to exploit both religious fervor and the contemporary debate over evolution, proving that people would pay to have their beliefs, whether pious or skeptical, validated in stone. A more modern example is the Hitler Diaries, published in 1983 by the German magazine Stern. These 60 volumes, purportedly written by the Nazi leader, were hailed as the historical find of the century. They were authenticated by a respected historian and purchased for millions. The world was desperate for an insider's view into the mind of such evil, a secret explanation for history's darkest chapter. The diaries, however, were clumsy forgeries, filled with historical errors and written on modern paper with post-war ink. They were believed because the story was so compelling, the supposed expert validation so reassuring, and the cultural hunger for a definitive narrative so intense. In each of these cases, you see the same blueprint that fits the Kensington mystery. First, a deep public hunger for a specific narrative, whether it's European superiority, proof of scripture, understanding evil, or in Kensington's case, a noble pioneer heritage for a proud immigrant community. Second, a charismatic champion, a respected scientist, a savvy showman, or a tireless true believer like H. Hjalmar Holland, who defends the artifact against growing doubt. And third, the exploitation of a gap in contemporary knowledge. In Piltdown's day, forensic dating methods were primitive. For the Cardiff Giant, geology was a popular fascination but not a precise public science. With the Hitler Diaries, forensic analysis of paper and ink was not the first thing on journalists' minds. The Kensington Runestone appeared when runology was an obscure academic specialty in America, and the detailed study of weathering rates in Greywacke was a century away. The forger, whether Olof Ohman or another, worked in the blind spots of the 1890s, just as the other hoaxers did in their own eras. These parallels do not definitively prove the Kensington stone is a fake, but they powerfully reframe it. It is no longer a solitary, bizarre anomaly. It is part of a recurring human pattern. We are storytellers by nature, and sometimes we are so eager for a particular story to be true that we become willing accomplices in our own deception. We overlook inconsistencies, rally behind persuasive advocates, and embrace the artifact that fills a hole in our world's narrative. The Kensington Runestone, then, is more than a potential Norse relic or a simple farmer's prank. It is a testament to a timeless truth. Sometimes the most powerful history is not the one that happened, but the one we desperately need to believe. That deep need to believe is the stone's most potent magic. The human mind is not a cold, impartial computer. It is a storyteller constantly weaving narratives from the threads of evidence it chooses to pick up. This is where a powerful force called confirmation bias takes the stage. Confirmation bias is our tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms what we already believe or want to be true. For a Scandinavian immigrant in 1900, every weathered groove on the Kensington stone wasn't just erosion, it was proof of ancient ancestors. For their descendants today, a complex geological analysis feels like vindication, while the linguist's detailed critique can be dismissed as academic arrogance. We all do this. We cling to the pieces of the puzzle that fit the picture we've already decided is beautiful, and we quietly set aside the pieces that don't. The Kensington Runestone is a perfect catalyst for this process because it offers just enough ambiguity. The weathering can be argued, the roots of the tree can be debated. This ambiguity creates a playground for belief, where hope and identity can fill in the gaps that science has not yet, and may never, completely close. This connects directly to the powerful allure of alternative history. There is something deeply romantic, even thrilling, about the idea that the history books are wrong. That the official story, taught in schools and guarded by university professors, is incomplete or even a deliberate cover-up. The Kensington narrative fits this template perfectly. It has all the classic elements of a conspiracy theory, but wrapped in the respectable cloak of archaeology. You have the lone, humble discoverer, Olof Ohman, an everyman who stumbles upon a world-changing secret. You have the coded message, written in ancient runes, requiring a specialist to unlock its meaning. You have the tragic, heroic tale of explorers betrayed and slaughtered. And most importantly, you have the clear battle between the elite, dismissive academic establishment and the passionate, everyday believers. This framework is incredibly satisfying. It transforms the viewer from a passive learner into a potential truth seeker, an underdog in a fight against a rigid system. Believing in the stone becomes an act of intellectual rebellion, a statement that you are not fooled by the official narrative. It makes you part of a special group, one that sees the hidden reality others miss. At its core, the Kensington mystery taps into a fundamental human love for the puzzle. We are wired to solve problems, to find patterns, to crack codes. The stone is a magnificent physical puzzle box. Its runes are the code, its location is a clue. The lack of other artifacts is a tantalizing complication. Our brains want to solve it, to connect the dots from Vinland to Minnesota, to imagine the route they took and the camp they built. This engagement is active and personal, far more compelling than memorizing a list of accepted historical facts. When you believe you are piecing together a suppressed truth, history stops being a dry subject and becomes a personal adventure. The stone's enduring power lies right here in this psychological space. It is not just an artifact to be authenticated, it is a story to be solved, a tribe to belong to, and a secret to protect. It allows us to be detectives in our own historical mystery, and that role is infinitely more captivating than being a student in someone else's lecture hall. Hjalmar Holand's shadow stretches long across this entire story. Without his relentless energy, the Kensington Runestone would likely have remained a curious footnote in a local newspaper, forgotten in a shed or discarded as an oddity. He was the engine that drove the mystery from a farmer's field onto the national stage, and for that alone, his place in the saga is guaranteed. But to understand the stone's enduring power, we must look clearly at the man who became its voice and ask a difficult question: was he a scholar uncovering truth or a showman building a legend? The evidence suggests he was a masterful blend of both, a true believer who shaped reality to fit his conviction, Ohman's dedication was undeniable. For over 50 years, he devoted his life to the stone. He traveled thousands of miles, interviewed elderly settlers, combed through historical archives in Europe, and wrote hundreds of pages of analysis. He single-handedly created an entire body of research where none existed, constructing a framework for the stone's authenticity. His work gave the artifact intellectual weight, a counter-argument to the quick dismissals of early linguists. He didn't just defend the stone, he built a world around it, populating the Minnesota landscape with Norse mooring stones, cryptic holes in rocks, and tales of iron weapons pulled from the prairie. He provided answers, and in a mystery, answers are a powerful currency, yet a closer look at his methods reveals a pattern of selective vision. Ohman was a prosecutor, not a judge. He presented evidence that supported his case with compelling flair, while often minimizing or ignoring facts that undermined it. When linguists pointed out the modern Swedish word, "uppdagelsephard," Ohman didn't grapple deeply with the linguistic impossibility. Instead, he shifted the argument, suggesting it was a secret code or a later addition, directing attention back to the physical weathering of the stone, where his narrative was stronger. He championed the discovery of mooring stones around Minnesota lakes, presenting them as clear proof of Norse boats, yet he rarely entertained the more mundane, and far more likely, explanation that they were holes drilled by 19th-century farmers for blasting or fencing. For Ohman, every unusual stone formation became a Norse artifact, every local legend a fragment of a lost saga. His research was extensive, but it was not impartial. It was a mission. This approach essentially created a self-sustaining mythos. Ohman didn't just present a theory, he presented a complete, thrilling alternative history. He connected the dots between disparate local finds, weaving them into a single epic narrative of Norse exploration and tragedy. He gave people a story they could see and touch, not just read about. In doing so, he transformed the Kensington Runestone from a solitary object into the keystone of a vast, hidden historical edifice. Once that edifice was built, it developed its own gravity. Disproving the stone was no longer just about analyzing runes. It was about dismantling an entire, beloved world that Ohman had constructed. He made disbelief feel like destruction. So, what is his true legacy? If you believe the stone is a forgery, then Hjalmar Ohman is the brilliant propagandist who gave a crude hoax a 50-year head start, wrapping it in such a captivating tale that it became fireproof against ordinary skepticism. He was the salesman who sold a dream. If you believe the stone is genuine, then he is the visionary researcher who fought against a closed-minded establishment, persevering to uncover a truth others were too rigid to see. He was the martyr for a lost history. In reality, he was likely something in between, a man so consumed by a beautiful idea that he could no longer distinguish between evidence and advocacy. But one thing is certain: the Kensington Runestone phenomenon as we know it, the museums, the debates, the cultural icon exists in the shape he carved for it. He is the irreplaceable architect. Without Hjalmar Ohman's passionate, flawed, and tireless crusade, this would just be a rock. With him, it became a legend that we are still trying to solve. So where does this leave us after more than a century of argument and analysis? The verdict from the world of academic history is not a mystery. It is clear, consistent, and definitive. The overwhelming consensus among professional historians, archaeologists, and linguists is that the Kensington Runestone is a 19th-century creation, a fascinating artifact of American immigrant culture, but not a medieval Norse relic. This is not a snap judgment or a closed-minded dismissal. It is the conclusion reached by applying the rigorous, peer-reviewed standards of evidence that define these disciplines, standards tested and refined over more than 100 years of scrutiny. The case for a hoax rests on three pillars of evidence that, when taken together, form an argument almost impossible to refute. First, and most decisively, are the linguistic anachronisms. The words carved into that stone are not simply odd, they are impossible for the claimed time period. The use of the modern Swedish word for an exploration journey, the Arabic numeral date written as we write it today, the jumbled runic alphabet mixing medieval and 18th century forms, these are not minor errors. They are catastrophic flaws. They are the equivalent of finding a letter supposedly written by George Washington that mentions traveling by airplane or using a zip code. The language itself convicts the inscription. It speaks unmistakably of the 19th century, not the 14th. Second, we have the profound archaeological silence. The stone tells a specific story of 30 men camping, fishing, and dying, yet not a single piece of corroborating physical evidence has ever been found. No Norse-style tools, no campfire remains dating to the 1300s, no burial sites for the 10 slain men. In a region thoroughly explored and farmed, this utter void is deafening. Real history leaves debris, a scatter of clues across the landscape. The Kensington story leaves only a solitary, perfectly composed narrative stone. This absence is not proof of a meticulous cleanup. It is proof of a story with no physical past. Finally, the historical context makes the entire expedition implausible. By 1362, the Norse settlements in Greenland were in severe decline, crippled by a cooling climate and isolation. The idea that a large, well-equipped party could be assembled for a fantastically dangerous journey 2,000 miles into an unknown continental interior, with no clear economic or survival motive, defies everything we know about that era. It is a saga born of 19th century romanticism, not 14th century reality. Mainstream academia does not reject the stone because it dislikes the story. It rejects the stone because the evidence demanded by its professions, linguistic coherence, archaeological corroboration, historical plausibility, is completely absent. The stone fails every test. To accept it as genuine, you would have to disregard the fundamental rules of evidence that allow us to reconstruct any reliable history at all. You would have to believe in a one-time only, miraculous exception to every standard of scholarship, and that is a belief, not a historical conclusion. So the academic verdict is in. The Kensington Runestone is a compelling, beautifully crafted piece of folklore, a monument not to Norse explorers, but to the hopes and pride of Scandinavian immigrants building a new home. Yet if the experts have spoken so clearly, why does the mystery feel more alive than ever? Perhaps the greatest lesson the Kensington Runestone offers is not about Vikings at all. Its true significance has quietly shifted, transforming over a century from a historical claim into a profound cultural artifact. This heavy slab of greywacke is now a genuine, invaluable window into the soul of 19th century America, specifically the hearts and minds of the Scandinavian immigrants who built new lives on the prairie. The story it tells most truthfully is not one of 14th century massacre, but of 19th century yearning. It is a physical monument to the powerful human need to belong, to root oneself in a new land with a story that dignifies the struggle. In this light, the debate over its authenticity almost misses the point. Whether carved by a desperate Norseman or a determined Swedish farmer, the stone is an authentic relic of the immigrant experience. It is a true story carved in stone, even if the saga it depicts is fiction. Think about what these immigrants faced. They had left everything familiar, crossing an ocean to settle in a vast, often intimidating landscape. They worked the hard soil, endured brutal winters, and navigated a society where their accents and customs marked them as outsiders. The dominant American narrative celebrated the pilgrims and the pioneers of westward expansion, a story that had no natural place for them. They needed a narrative of their own, a foundational myth that connected their old world heritage to their new world reality. The Kensington Runestone provided that myth in the most spectacular way possible. It did not merely suggest their ancestors had visited, it proclaimed they had conquered the interior, faced tragedy with courage, and prayed to God on this very soil. It was a gift of unimaginable psychological value. This stone told them and tells us that they were not latecomers but inheritors. Their labor on this land was not an invasion but a homecoming. This process of identity building through invented or embraced history is not unique. It is a fundamental part of the American story. Consider the tales of Pocahontas and John Smith, romanticized for generations to soften the brutal realities of colonial conflict. Or the legend of George Washington and the cherry tree, a fable invented after his death to teach a moral lesson about honesty, cementing his image as a figure of flawless virtue. Nations and communities often craft such stories to explain their origins and define their character. The Kensington Runestone is Minnesota's version of this universal phenomenon. It is a founding myth for a specific community, carved not in epic poetry, but in what appeared to be ancient stone. Its power came from its tangibility. You could touch it, it was proof you could hold in your hand, pulled from the very earth they were farming. This physicality made the myth feel inevitable, a truth waiting to be uncovered. The stone also stands as a timeless case study in the eternal conflict between expert authority and popular belief. On one side stood the linguists and historians, armed with specialized knowledge about runic evolution and medieval grammar. Their verdict was based on rules, patterns, and standards of evidence built over centuries of scholarship. On the other side stood a community, and later a captivated public, whose judgment was based on emotion, identity, and the visceral power of a good story. This is not a battle where one side is simply right and the other foolish. It is a clash of different ways of knowing. The experts dealt in probabilities and peer review. The public dealt in possibilities and profound personal meaning. The stone became a rallying point for those who distant academic gatekeepers, a symbol that the official history books could be wrong. This tension is everywhere today, from debates over ancient aliens to controversies about public health. The Kensington story is a century-old preview of our modern informational landscape, where a compelling narrative often travels faster and digs deeper than a complex, nuanced fact. Ultimately, the Kensington Runestone teaches us that objects are never just objects. They are vessels for our hopes, our pride, and our need for connection. A forged painting is still a real artifact of the forger's skill and era. A counterfeit coin tells a true story of economic desire and deception. In the same way, this Minnesota stone is a genuine archaeological find from the year 1898. It tells an undeniable truth about the people who lived then, their cultural pride, their hunger for a place in history, their cleverness, and perhaps their loneliness. The runes may spell out a fictional journey from Vinland, but they silently scream a very real journey from Stockholm or Oslo to the Minnesota frontier. That is the stone's authentic inscription, the one written not with a chisel but with the immense weight of human aspiration. It reminds us that sometimes the most important history is not what happened, but what we need to believe happened in order to understand who we are. That slab of Minnesota greywacke has traveled a long road from the grip of an aspen root. It began as a local curiosity, was dismissed as a crude fraud, championed as a lost saga, debated in Supreme Courts, and finally enshrined as a cultural icon. Its journey mirrors the American experience itself, a story of discovery, controversy, and the relentless search for identity. For over a century, this stone has forced historians and hobbyists, scientists and storytellers to clash over its meaning. And if, after all this, you find yourself without a definitive answer, you are in good company. The mystery persists by design. The Kensington Runestone's true power is not in providing a solution, but in igniting the investigation. It makes us all detectives, sifting through linguistic clues and geological reports, weighing human motives against the silent testimony of stone. It reminds us that history is not a closed book, but an ongoing conversation, sometimes a heated argument, about what our past means. This conversation is yours to join. If you ever find yourself in Minnesota, make the trip to Alexandria, stand in front of the actual stone in its museum. Look at the grooves worn smooth by time or cleverness, read the translation of that desperate message, examine the evidence for and against with your own eyes. Then ask yourself the ultimate question, the one that has echoed for generations: is this America's greatest historical hoax, or a forgotten page of its deepest history? Your conclusion becomes part of the stone's living legacy. In the end, the most fascinating mystery here may not be about 14th century explorers at all. It is about us. Why does this particular story, carved in this particular rock, captivate us so completely? Perhaps because it speaks to a hope that history is more adventurous, more inclusive, and more mysterious than our textbooks allow. The stone endures because we want a world where lost Vikings could sail into the heart of the continent, where a simple farmer could uncover a secret that changes everything. We want to believe in the possibility of a hidden past, waiting just beneath the surface of a familiar field. So what do you think? After this deep dive into the runes, the weathering, and the motives, does the Kensington Runestone feel like history or folklore to you? Share your verdict in the comments below, and if you enjoyed unraveling this enigma, subscribe for more journeys into the world's greatest historical